Well, hello there once again to the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast. I'm your host, Matt Donnelly, and we're going to go through our week number 8 must start and must sit players for fantasy football. That's right, we're going to take you on a journey that includes the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, the running backs, and the tight ends to help inform you of the decisions that you need to make here for those fantasy rosters as you continue to make a push for those fantasy championships. That being said, we're also going to talk about the latest news around the National Football League and kind of recap everything that was week number 7. With that in mind, let's get right into it. Let's start with the news and notes coming back from last week. And some of the biggest news fresh off the presses here, so to speak, is the Titans' willingness to make some deals. We already saw them trade Kevin Byard to the Philadelphia Eagles. They got Edmonds back there and whatnot, but it wasn't exactly a big deal because we were looking at this. This is a team in Tennessee that has all kinds of questions going forward. One of those questions is, for the first time in franchise history, I think they're strongly considering listening to offers when it comes to Derrick Henry. Now, that may not seem like a significant news, but when we look at how that could reshape the fantasy landscape, there's a team out there right now that it could acquire one of the best backs in the league. Now, be it a back who's entered his 8th NFL season, that's typically when we've seen regression take place amongst the running back position. We're also hearing that they have been shopping around DeAndre Hopkins the last few weeks. Unfortunately, his contract makes that a little bit more difficult, and teams aren't exactly jumping at these offers to bring Hopkins onto their roster. Now, also sticking with the Tennessee Titans and that roster, we also heard from Mike Vrabel back on, I believe it was Wednesday, that they are going to name Will Levis the starter. Now, what does that mean? It means, well, a whole heck of a lot of nothing right now, because he also did mention that we're going to see Malik Willis. They're both going to be out there. And if Derrick Henry isn't traded before Sunday, we'll probably see some sort of king package that involves Derrick Henry under center too. So we are looking at a team that probably is going with a quarterback by committee type approach. There's going to be a special package for Malik Willis. He's going to get into the game. But Will Levis, now let's talk about Will Levis for a second, because coming out of college, he had one of the most decorated prospect profiles out there. We know he's got the big arm. We know he likes mayo in his coffee. We know he eats bananas like a savage. The thing is, he went into training camp this offseason already injured, which put him behind Malik Willis when it came to the team's depth chart. Now we are seeing by week number 8, he's already surpassed Malik Willis, and now he is the quarterback there who is going to step up for Ryan Tannehill, who's expected to mess the next few weeks here with that ankle injury, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because we've seen what this offense looks like with Ryan Tannehill. And it's not fantasy relevant. Now we could possibly see Chigakonko get back into it. Treylon Burks get back into it. Nick Westbrook-Akeem, he could be a factor as well. So these are kind of names that you need to put on your fantasy radar moving forward. Another quarterback that may or may not be able to play this week is Daniel Jones, who is back at practice, but still not cleared for contact. What does that mean for fantasy? Hey, the longer Daniel Jones stays away from this Giants team, the better this is for your fantasy rosters. We're talking about Tyrod Taylor here, who seemed to have been able to get Darren Waller back on track. Darren Waller, Wan'Dale Robinson, even Darius Slade have all seen upticks in their fantasy value since Tyrod Taylor took over under center. So I'm not in a big hurry to see what Daniel Jones looks like when he gets back. But when he does come back, let's be honest, Tyrod Taylor will be relegated back to the bench when all is said and done. Now let's take a look at some of these other things we're looking around the league. Let's go back to week number 7, see if we can identify maybe some patterns here moving forward. And one of the biggest things of interest for me is Gardner Minshew. QB3 last week, 30 fantasy points, 15 of 23 for 305 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns versus the Cleveland Browns. This is the Cleveland Browns team that ranked number 1 against the quarterbacks when it came to allowing fantasy points to the position. After the game, they dropped down all the way to 7th. That is what Minshew Mania does to a team. It runs wild all over you. And it's not just that. He's getting everybody involved. We're talking about the involvement here of Michael Pittman, of Josh Downs. We've seen upticks in both these guys' potential here moving forward. And this is something I think we can anticipate being a real thing as the season progresses. When we look at fantasy points per game, Josh Downs, wide receiver 13 in the 3 starts that Gardner Minshew has played for the Colts. Michael Pittman, 18.6 fantasy points per game. That puts him at wide receiver 12. So you've got 2 borderline wide receiver ones here, courtesy of Gardner Minshew. And we know that Richardson is not coming back anytime soon. He is shut down for the season. So this is Minshew's offense moving forward. And the thing we really like about this is Minshew doesn't need a whole lot of volume to put up production. Look what he did. We just talked about that right here. 15 completions, 305 yards. YOLO. We're talking Michael Pittman averaged like 41.5 yards per reception. Josh Downs, 25 yards per reception. This is something that I think we can expect moving forward from Gardner Minshew. So if you are looking for a quarterback just to kind of get you by for the time being, you could do worse than Gardner Minshew right now. Now, a couple other quarterbacks, we talked about Tyrod Taylor. He was also a top 8 fantasy option last week, and so was McCorkle Jones from the New England Patriots. I don't see either one of those guys maintaining fantasy value. Tyrod Taylor is going to be able to make other players around him more productive, and McCorkle Jones, I think that's more of a one-up type thing, although he does face a favorable matchup as far as quarterbacks are concerned when the Patriots take on the Miami Dolphins this week. Let's turn our attention to the running back position from last week. And Donta Foreman, who absolutely crushed my Las Vegas Raiders. 2 rushing touchdowns, a receiving touchdown. Truck stick Marcus Epps on a couple of occasions. It was bad news for the Raiders all the way across the board. And then Rachaad White, a guy who has under-delivered so far this season. RB14, not because of his rushing, because 13 carries for 34 yards doesn't get the job done. But 6 receptions for 65 yards, that's 12 and a half fantasy points right there at the running back position. Man, PPR is so messed up. I'm sorry. When you are getting a guy like Rachaad White who has 13 carries for 34 yards, but because he catches 6 passes, now has double-digit fantasy points, that's not. It seems a little odd, so to speak. Now, let's look at the wide receiver position here from last week and rookie fever. We already talked about Josh Downs, wide receiver 6, 5 catches, 125 yards, and a touchdown. Rashee Rice, wide receiver 13 with his 5-catch, 60-yard performance and a touchdown there as well. But the 2 biggest names, Puka Nacua, he's been doing this all season long. Him and Jamar Chase are like the only wide receivers that have like 750 yards receiving after the first 7 career games. He went out there last week, 8 catches, 158 yards, no touchdowns. But Jordan Addison, he had that dog in him last week. Wide receiver 1. That's right, wide receiver 1. 7 catches, 123 yards or something like that. He also had 2 touchdowns, 10 targets. Kirk Cousins, that primetime label, he has discarded that altogether. Kirk Cousins, 2 big-time primetime games here so far in 2023. And yes, hey, look, we were talking about what will Justin Jefferson do if this Minnesota Vikings team doesn't start winning. Well, guess what? They were 1-4 when Jefferson went down. They're now 3-4. That's going to make Jefferson return a little bit quicker than maybe before. And that takes kind of the Minnesota Vikings out of the whole sellers type mentality because they're right back in the whole playoff picture there in the NFC. So if we're going to talk about the fantasy production last week, we got to talk about the injuries that are adding up. The good news is there's no bye weeks this week, so you can start your studs and feel more than comfortable about it. But we got to talk about these injuries. Daniel Jones got that neck. Justin Fields, he's already been ruled out there with that thumb. Ryan Tannehill, he's out with that ankle. Jimmy Garoppolo, back issues. And Deshaun Watson, head, shoulder, knees, and toes, pretty much everything. He is out, and we're going to get P.J. Walker this week. Now, we also know at the wide receiver position, week 7, there were some bad vibes going on. Deebo Samuel missed, DK Metcalf missed, Zay Jones, Juju Smith-Schuster. We're going to get all those wide receivers back with maybe the exception of Deebo Samuel right now. And the best part about this is Tank Dell, he's also looking to make his return here in week number 8. Now, we do need to monitor a couple big names here, including Miami Dolphins wide receivers. Yes, wide receivers plural, as Jalen Waddle, he exited last week's contest, and Tyreek Hill, he popped up with a hip injury here on Wednesday. Also, keep in mind, Christian Watson, the Green Bay Packers, he returned to practice, so he should be ready to go this week. At the running back position, we're still without David Montgomery. He's still dealing with that rib injury. I'm still pretty confident we're not going to see him back until the Lions bye week or after the Lions bye week. Rashawn Johnson still has not cleared the concussion protocol. We know that Jerome Ford, he's dealing with that ankle injury. Miles Sanders is dealing with a shoulder injury. Bijan Robinson is dealing with an Arthur Smith issue. We've also got Pat Freiermuth and Greg Dulcich, both out with hamstrings at the tight end position. Zach Ertz, he's now on the IR. We also know Jawan Johnson of the Saints. He's got that calf. He's missed the last 4 or 5 contests. And Dawson Knox is out with that wrist injury. All right, now let's get into the starts and sits here for week number 1. Let's talk about some quarterbacks that you can start. We know that you're starting your studs. There's no doubt about that. There's some great matchups to be had. You look across the board right now at the quarterback position and who's available, who's not. And I look at the matchups, and Jalen Hurts, good matchup. Justin Herbert, great matchup. Patrick Mahomes, another great matchup. Lamar Jackson, another great matchup. So you should feel good about starting your studs. Now, one other quarterback that I really like this week, and maybe it's just the pettiness in me and all this, is C.J. Stroud going up against the Carolina Panthers. Now, if you remember, the Carolina Panthers selected Bryce Young over C.J. Stroud, number 1 overall in last year's entry draft. So you know there's going to be a chip on C.J. Stroud's shoulder, and I love that. He also has Nathaniel Dell there, Tank Dell, coming back potentially this week from his concussion. We know Nico Collins is balling out. This Carolina Panthers team is ripe for the pickings when it comes to the run game. So Dameon Pierce could have another breakout. More on him a little bit later. But you look at this. And Stroud, he has scored at least 18 fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 contests, including the last 3 games in which he has at least 24.5 fantasy points. You put the Carolina Panthers down his way, he's going to hit 25 fantasy points here yet again in week number 8. Carolina, they have been absolutely scorched here. Both Jared Goff there, Tua Tagovailoa, each scored over 26 fantasy points in the last couple weeks. After watching what Tua Tagovailoa and Jared Goff have done to this Panthers secondary in the last couple weeks, there's very good reason to believe that C.J. Stroud could easily be a top 10 fantasy option this week, especially with the Panthers likely to have Jeremy Chin with that quad injury and Yatir Gross-Matos, that hamstring injury, still on injured reserve. So there's the best defensive pieces that Carolina possibly could have to stop the pass are not going to be present for this game. Another quarterback that I really like this week is we're digging a little bit deeper here, and this all depends, again, on the health. But if you were desperate, if you're looking for that Brock Purdy type replacement, because Brock Purdy suddenly came down with concussion-like symptoms on the flight home from Minnesota, then maybe Jimmy Garoppolo could be that guy. He's kind of that sleeper for me this week, considering that the Detroit Lions are allowing 17.96 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks this season. And we just watched what Lamar Jackson did to him last week, 357 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Not all is well and good in Las Vegas right now. They are desperate for a win. They're desperate for any kind of offensive production, especially Davante Adams. Jacoby Myers is a top 15 wide receiver, probably here on out. Davante Adams, he's a top 12 wide receiver here on out. We just need Adams to get that production. It hasn't been there. That squeaky wheel we thought we were going to get last week, that squeaky wheel game, it never materialized. So when I look at this, this has to be the game to get Davante Adams back. We know that there's a rift between Josh McDaniels and this team. The best way to fix that rift is to get some wins, and they have to get it this week after a very disappointing performance against the Chicago Bears just a week ago. Some other quarterbacks I feel good about this week. How about Jared Goff versus the Las Vegas Raiders? Listen, pretty much anyone going against the Las Vegas Raiders, you should feel pretty good about in fantasy. But Goff comes into this contest with 1,900 yards under his belt, 13 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions, averaging about 21.1 fantasy points per game. And at home, he's a completely different player there. He's averaging 20-plus fantasy points per game, while on the road, he's been held to like 16 or less in 3 of the last 4 contests. So the Raiders, they've been okay when it comes to opposing quarterbacks for the past 3 weeks, but we're talking about Jordan Love, Mac Jones, Tyson Bagent there. I mean, these aren't exactly the same type of quarterbacks in that Jared Goff caliber. Now, another quarterback that, hey, it doesn't matter anymore. Kirk Cousins is a QB1 from this point on. He is coming off a strong game against the San Francisco 49ers. Every time I seem to count him out, I remember counting him out when they played the Philadelphia Eagles on prime time, and all he did there was go for like 370 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. Well, guess what? He did it again on prime time against the San Francisco 49ers. He put up 25 fantasy points. The guy has 16 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, over 2,000 yards passing, averaging 23.2 fantasy points per game. And he has scored at least 23.9 fantasy points in 4 of the last 6 games. You could start Kirk Cousins. It doesn't matter where anymore. This is not just one of those things, oh, Kirk Cousins on prime time. It's past 8 p.m. He's probably should be in bed. No, you're going to start Kirk Cousins. It's that simple right now. Don't overthink it. Start him. Another quarterback I feel good about this week is going to be Dak Prescott. Yes, that's right. Dak Prescott's a quarterback I'm actually feeling good about. His year-to-date stats are not great. 1,333 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. But listen, Dak Prescott, when he comes off a bye week, he's averaging 26.9 fantasy points per game. Now let's turn our attention to some quarterbacks that maybe you're not starting this week. And for me, I don't know how you don't start Joe Burrow, but I'm a little worried about this because we watched Kirk Cousins make the San Francisco 49ers defense look silly last week. They're going to want to get some kind of payback here, and it could come at Joe Burrow's expense. San Francisco, they're one of the top defenses in the National Football League when it comes to limiting opposing quarterbacks. They've allowed about less than 10 fantasy points per game, Kirk Cousins notwithstanding here. Now, the bye week for Burrow, it came at a perfect time to kind of get that calf injury looked at there. He's coming into probably the healthiest he's been all season. But San Francisco, they sacked the quarterback 44 times last season. They're on pace to do it again 42 and a half times this year. They also had about 20 interceptions last year. They're on pace to have 28. This is a team that has twice as many interceptions as passing touchdowns allowed. So Burrow and the Bengals, they're going to have their work cut out for them. And if they're not on point, this could be a very long game for Joe Burrow. Some quarterbacks that I'm sitting this week, it's Geno Smith against the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland is one of the best teams at defending opposing quarterbacks, and Smith, he simply hasn't been that good. We talked about this in the offseason if you've been watching the show, the whole Dave Canales effect. Baker Mayfield, he's starting to look like an actual quarterback once again. Meanwhile, Geno Smith, who lost his quarterback coach there, Dave Canales, to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Funny how that works. He has struggled. 1,391 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 16 fantasy points per game there. I just can't get behind Geno Smith anymore. I just can't trust him in my starting lineup. There's other quarterbacks that I feel much better about. Sam Howell's another quarterback that I'm sitting. He had a solid game against Philadelphia back in week number 4, but he's got the Eagles. The Eagles got some film on him here heading into week number 8. He's got 1,749 yards passing, 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and this Eagles team, they're getting healthier. Darius Slay, he's healthy. Jalen Carter, he's healthy. They just added Kevin Byard from the Tennessee Titans. This Eagles team is getting better at every single level. Another quarterback that is kind of a buyer beware, it's going to be Matthew Stafford versus the Dallas Cowboys. I watched that film, and there was a few passes from Stafford that kind of sailed a little high from his intended targets. It looked like he had a little bit of a hitch in his step. You cannot show weakness against the Dallas Cowboys. I don't care if you have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua there balling out. They're going to get their stats. Don't get me wrong. But the thing with Matthew Stafford is he's got 7 touchdowns. He's also got 6 interceptions. So the good comes with the bad. You're going to get that with Matthew Stafford. And when you got a team like the Dallas Cowboys who can bring pressure the way that they do, and they can pick off their quarterback the way that they do, this could be one of those games where Stafford throws 2-3 touchdowns, but he also has 2 or 3 interceptions, which brings down that fantasy value where you're looking at a quarterback that's going to give you 15 and a half, maybe 16 points at most. So just to kind of recap how I have quarterbacks right now, I got Patrick Mahomes at number 1, followed by Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, and Josh Allen. That's my top 5 quarterbacks this week. Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, Trevor Lawrence, C.J. Stroud comes in at number 9, and Joe Burrow comes in at 10, followed by Kirk Cousins and Dak Prescott. Brock Purdy, he was in there, but obviously those concussion symptoms there that hit him on the plane have become problematic. So that's my top 12 fantasy quarterbacks for week number 8. Now turning our attention to the running back position. When I look at the running back right now, one of my must-start players is probably because he's one of the most disrespected running backs in the National Football League, and that is Isaiah Pacheco. He is going against the Denver Broncos team that is allowing 37 fantasy points per game to opposing backs. And in the last 4 contests, that number is considerably higher. How much higher? 46.78 fantasy points per game. That includes 6 rushing touchdowns to go along with 744 rushing yards. That doesn't even include adding in 4 receiving touchdowns, 207 receiving yards, and 32 receptions. And the thing about Pacheco, he's more than just a running back. He's 14th, I think, in targets, 21 of 23 this season. You're adding targets and receptions to Isaiah Pacheco's game here right now. He's already a top 12, 13 running back when it comes to rushing yards. He finishes like the RB6 in rushing yards on the back end of the season last season. So you add passing to his rushing totals, and he's one of those guys who's going to go out there and win some championships for you. And going in against the Denver Broncos this week, look out. Another running back you're going to start this week is, let's go back to D'Onta Foreman. We know that Tyson Bagent is going to be back under center, even if Roschon Johnson clears concussion protocol. How do you put the rookie in there with another rookie? D'Onta Foreman is a proven commodity when it comes to running a backfield. He did this in Carolina last season. And if you look at next-gen stats, he has been one of the most efficient runners over the last couple seasons. And I'm not just talking about because he put up 2 rushing touchdowns and a catching touchdown there against the Raiders last week. This is something that he has been able to do. And this week, he goes against the Los Angeles Chargers. So you look at this. Chargers have allowed running backs to score at least 13 PPR fantasy points per game in all 6 contests this season. So basically, we already know that Foreman's floor is 13 fantasy points. That's guaranteed to get you RB2 numbers no matter how you want to look at it. Another running back that I'm going to be starting this week is Dameon Pierce versus Carolina. Pierce has had the bye week to kind of sulk in the corner and wonder what has gone wrong. Now he's going to look to exploit a Panthers defense, a run defense that is allowing 33.63 fantasy points per game this season. The Panthers, they're also coming off a bye, and they have watched opposing running backs score 11 times on the ground this season and churn out over 800 rushing yards. That is the 3rd most. And they already had their bye. And that's also only on 152 carries. So you know that these runs, they're coming off in big-time chunk plays. Even with every running back playing this week, if we take all these buys out, because there's no buys this week, Pierce factors to be a top 24 running back, no matter how you slice it, with how favorable this matchup is. And if he doesn't get the job done, this could be his last stand right now, because Devin Singletary is just waiting for that opportunity. Want another running back? How about, let's go with Ramondre Stevenson here. I mean, he's going against the Miami Dolphins, and this is a Miami team that Stevenson historically has done very well against. Look back to last season and the numbers in which he was able to produce. The other thing that makes Stevenson appealing this week is Miami has allowed a running back to score a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. So you should feel comfortable that Stevenson or even Ezekiel Elliott is going to find the end zone somehow, some way in this contest. Another running back that I feel pretty confident in here, and you have to dig a little bit deeper because most fantasy managers have been disappointed with Rachaad White's performances over much of the season. But this week, he's facing a Bills team that over the last 4 weeks is allowing opposing running backs to average 27.98 fantasy points per game. They've given up 427 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns, 21 receptions, and 182 yards. Those reception totals, that is where Rachaad White's going to butter his bread. 6 catches last week for about 65 yards. That was 12.5 fantasy points for Rachaad White. Expect a very similar type performance here against the Buffalo Bills. So White has that RB2 type value. Now, running backs this week that I'm not feeling very good about, and it starts with Brian Robinson Jr. going against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles are the stingiest team in the National Football League this season when it comes to opposing running backs in fantasy. They're only allowing 13.91 fantasy points per game. They've given up just, I think it's like 350 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns all season long. These are numbers that do not bode well for Brian Robinson. Yes, the Commanders have got him involved in the passing game to a degree so far this season, but still, the Eagles have only allowed 214 receiving yards to backs on 35 receptions. So there's not a path for success for Brian Robinson unless he gets lucky and falls into the end zone at some point. Another running back this week I don't feel good about is Miles Sanders. He's still dealing with those shoulder injuries. He's set to return this week, but he has been god-awful when it comes to production so far this season. He has been outproduced every way, every possible way by Chuba Hubbard. If you look at the numbers, Sanders has 61 carries this year for 190 yards. That works out to 3.1 yards per carry. Meanwhile, Chuba Hubbard has 54 carries for 242 yards. That's 4.5 yards per carry. Where Hubbard is making the difference is he has been far more explosive. Now, I don't know if Sanders is dealing with that groin injury that slowed him down, or the shoulder injury slowed him down, or whatever injury it has been that slowed Miles Sanders down. Even if he's available this week, Chuba Hubbard is actually a better option over Miles Sanders. Now, another running back you need me to sit is Zach Moss. Yes, I'm going Zach Moss versus New Orleans. Everything Zach Moss has done has worked out fantastic for fantasy managers. The problem now is we're watching this Colts backfield completely shift back to where its natural place is in fantasy circles. And that is Jonathan Taylor back in the saddle. Last week, both Taylor and Moss each had 18 carries. Taylor turned that into 75 yards to Moss's 57. But when we look at Jonathan Taylor's role by percentage of expected fantasy points in this backfield, it's gone from 19.5 to 48.7 to 61.9%. And if you look at Jonathan Taylor's snap shares, you can see why. 15%, 42%, 50%. So you can expect a kind of a split here moving forward, 65-35 or 70-30 in favor of Taylor, which means limited opportunities for Zach Moss. He's been fantastic for fantasy managers. It's just Cinderella's shoe. It's about to strike midnight, whatever you want to call it. Moss, it's not looking good. And of course, I can't preach about must-sit players until I talk about Javonte Williams. He's one of my guys. I love Javonte Williams. I really do. The numbers just haven't been there. 8.3 fantasy points per game. Just 272 rushing yards to date. 14 receptions for a running back who's supposed to be a more than capable pass-catching back. In week 6 at Kansas City, Williams only had 10 carries for 52 yards. And I'm going to expect him to struggle again in this contest against the Kansas City Chiefs, who are one of the best defenses in the National Football League. In fact, when we take a look at it, they are ranked 5th when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the position, 15.67 all season. They've given up just 574 yards rushing this year, and they've only given up 2 rushing touchdowns. These are not numbers that bode well for Javonte Williams here in week number 8. Now, if we look at my rankings at the running back position for week number 8, it's Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Austin Eckler, Breece Hall comes in at 4, Travis Etienne rounds out the top 5. From 6 to 10, we have Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard, Isaiah Pacheco, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Kenneth Walker. 11 to 15, Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, Jonathan Taylor, Donta Foreman. Yes, I got Donta Foreman here at 14, and Bijan Robinson at number 15. 16 through 20 is Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Rachaad White, Joe Mixon, and Aaron Jones. And to round out the top 24 running backs this week, we have James Cook, Javonte Williams, Chuba Hubbard, and Dameon Pierce. That's right. Alexander Madison, Ramondre Stevenson just missed the cut here. All right, let's keep things moving along, and let's talk about those must-start, must-sit wide receivers, starting with Christian Kirk versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Yes, he is another one of my guys heading into 2023, and he has outperformed a lot of people's expectations. I know, in fact, he's made me look good because I am a Christian Kirk truther. I watched the videos, and you know what? People had every right to be out there on Calvin Ridley. He looked fantastic throughout the offseason, throughout all the drills, but Christian Kirk, my faith never wavered one bit. Even after week number 1, people were coming at me left, right, and center. Well, guess what? I get the last laugh here right now. Now, when we look at what Christian Kirk has been able to do, he has found success ever since week number 2, where he is averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game. He's put up over 100 fantasy points over that period of time, and he has at least 78 yards receiving and or a touchdown in 6 straight games. Last week against the Saints, Kirk once again had one of his 6 receptions that led to a touchdown, not to mention 19 fantasy points and 90 yards receiving. We talk about that matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers, they are 30th when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. That's not good. If you look, that's on the season. They have given up over 1,238 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, 42.57 fantasy points per game. over the last 4 weeks. So they've given up 604 yards and 3 touchdowns, not to mention 38.9. That is the 5th most in the National Football League. Another good start of the wide receiver position is going to be Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Yeah, that's right. I'm back on Houston this week. CJ Stroud, that revenge narrative. It's not really that revenge narrative that we're used to, but that chip on the shoulder is going to lead to big-time fantasy production for Nico Collins this week. And Nico Collins, he's done nothing but produce this season. 17 fantasy points per game, 547 yards, 3 touchdowns, and this is Nico Collins, who's coming off a bye week in week number 7. So he has produced this in just 6 games. So you know he's going to produce. And Carolina, they've actually been pretty good when it comes to defending wide receivers this season. They rank 11th in the league. They've only given up 31.6 fantasy points per game, only yielded 6 touchdowns and 876 yards. The problem here is they give it up to wide receiver ones on opposing teams. Chris Olave back in week 2, 14.6 fantasy points. DK Metcalf over 17 fantasy points. Justin Jefferson, 26.5 fantasy points. Josh Reynolds had 17.5 fantasy points. And then and that was with Amon-Ra St. Brown out, so you can classify Josh Reynolds as the number 1 there. And forget about it when it came to Tyreek Hill, who put up 28 fantasy points against the Carolina Panthers. So we know that while Carolina's secondary has been good, they have struggled when it came to defending the number 1 wide receiver on their on opposing teams here. And while Carolina has been good against wide receivers, as I kind of mentioned, you look at the number 1s, and that is where they've struggled. So Nico Collins is that number 1 for the Houston Texans. Expect a big game for him this week. And sticking in that whole Jacksonville-Pittsburgh game, George Pickens. You know I love Kenny Pickett this week because he just offers so much. Well, guess what? He's got 2 targets there, one in Deontay Johnson and another one in George Pickens, who has been absolutely out of his mind the last few weeks. He has now scored at least 15.5 fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 contests. You could call this a sophomore breakout if you want, but this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, like if you look at what the Jaguars have been able to do defensively, it has not been very good for them in recent memory. We talk about them being 8th when it comes to opposing quarterbacks. As far as fantasy is concerned, well, when we look at what they've done against opposing wide receivers, they rank 22nd. That means they've given up over 1,200 yards receiving and 8 touchdowns. They're allowing over 36.9 fantasy points per game. There's only 2 wide receivers that are going to produce for the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's Deontay Johnson and Pickens. So this is telling me if I'm looking at 36 fantasy points per game, I'm thinking close to 18 to 19 of those are going to go to Pickens this week. Want a couple more deeper type wide receivers you can trust? How about Josh Downs? I mean, you could trust Michael Pittman in that as well. We talked about how good they've been playing with Gardner Minshew. There's no reason to believe that they can't keep this up with the New Orleans Saints. Now, I expect Marshawn Lattimore to be kind of favoring over to Michael Pittman's side, which means Josh Downs is going to be the primary recipient. He's put up over 400 receiving yards, 33 receptions to go with those 2 touchdowns so far this season in his rookie campaign. And we know that Minshew's not afraid to let it rip, so you can trust Josh Downs here in week number 8. Another deeper sleeper for me. How about Kendrick Bourne versus the Miami Dolphins? Yes, McCorkle Jones is a sleeper in his own right as far as the quarterback position is concerned, but someone's got to be that guy, and it's Kendrick Bourne this season. 370 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, over 12.5 fantasy points per game. Juju Smith-Schuster is supposed to come back this week, but that really has nothing to do with Kendrick Bourne. Juju Smith-Schuster, he shouldn't be playing. Let's be honest. You know how I feel. If you've watched any of the shows, you know that I am an anti-Juju Smith-Schuster person here. There's no way I can get behind him. Now, if we look at what we have seen from Bourne, he is by far the best receiver that New England has. Against the Raiders, against the Bills, he had at least 16.3 fantasy points in each of those contests. He has 18 targets, 16 catches, 152 yards over that period of span. This is now 4 games this season in which we've seen Bourne get at least 7 targets. So you know opportunity is going to be there. And against the Miami Dolphins, the Patriots are going to have to throw to stay in this contest. So expect Bourne to be a big part of that. Now on the flip side of the coin, there are some receivers that I think you should be definitely considering sitting this week. And it starts with one of the guys that I don't want to go there with, but it's CeeDee Lamb versus the Los Angeles Rams. These are 2 of the best pass defenses going head-to-head this week. The only difference between Lamb and Kupp and Nakua is There's two of the other Rams there, right? There's two Rams and only one Lamb here, and that is not a good thing for CeeDee Lamb. Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, they're going to get theirs. Dallas has to choose one or the other. LA is going to be focusing on what CeeDee Lamb is and is not going to be able to do. Lamb only has one touchdown this season. It came way back on like October 1st against that New England Patriots team. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Rams, they've only yielded one receiving touchdown here so far to a wide receiver. So the law of averages here is telling me that CeeDee Lamb is in for a long day when it comes to producing against this Rams team. Other wide receivers that I'm considering sitting this week is Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos against the Kansas City Chiefs. Look, Jeudy, he still doesn't have a touchdown this season. Back in week number 6, he only had 3 catches for like 14 yards against the Chiefs. The Chiefs have found a way to stop Jerry Jeudy. So don't expect Jerry Jeudy to suddenly get it going here against the Chiefs, who are one of the stingiest teams in the league against wide receivers as well. This Chiefs team is one of the best altogether when we talk about defensive abilities here, as far as fantasy is concerned. 9th in the league right now, 30.41 fantasy points per game. They've given up just 5 touchdowns this season altogether. So Jerry Jeudy, I don't want you anywhere near my lineup. DeAndre Hopkins, same thing goes for you. The Will Levis, Malik Willis, Derrick Henry. I don't care who's under center for this contest. I don't like this matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Why do I not like this matchup against the Atlanta Falcons? Because Atlanta is the 6th best team when it comes to limiting opposing wide receivers in fantasy. They have given up just 28.86 fantasy points per game. They have given up just 895 yards and 6 touchdowns to date. DeAndre Hopkins, he's got like 370 yards receiving this season with 0 touchdowns. Everything that he's done so far this season has been for naught. And I don't see this Tennessee Titans offense getting any better anytime soon, even with Will Levis under center. So DeAndre Hopkins is another sit for me this week. As is Tyler Lockett versus the Cleveland Browns. I mean, DK Metcalf coming back may open things up for Tyler Lockett. We've seen Jackson Smith and Jigba benefit from Metcalf missing last week. But the problem here is Jake Bobo was even more involved than Tyler Lockett. I don't like this. I don't like this. Lockett, he finished with just like four catches last week there for about 38 yards. That is not good. Now he's playing this Cleveland Browns defense that is one of the best when it comes to defending wide receivers. Yes, Gardner Minshew did what he did last week, but Cleveland is still number 1. Yes, number 1 in the league when it comes to wide receivers in fantasy. They're giving up just 22.95 fantasy points per game. And even though we saw what Gardner Minshew did, put up over 300 yards passing, this Browns team is still only given up 732 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns so far this season. Now, the one wide receiver I'm very interested in is Calvin Ridley. Can he turn it around against the Pittsburgh Steelers? We know that Christian Kirk's good. We know Christian Kirk's number 1, but we still have to believe that Calvin Ridley can get the job done. Can he this week? I don't know. That's why he's kind of on my fade, but I'm kind of interested to see him do well. Now, here are my top, 36 wide receivers heading into week number 8, starting with Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, and Amon St. Brown. 6 through 10 is Keenan Allen, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Brandon Ayuk, and Adam Thielen. 11 through 15 is Puka Nacua, CeeDee Lamb, Jordan Addison, Mike Evans, and Terry McLaurin. 16 through 20 is George Pickens, Christian Kirk, Nico Collins, Chris Olave, Zay Flowers. 21 through 25, that happens to be Jalen Waddle if he is healthy and playing. Devontae Smith, Amari Cooper, Jacoby Myers, who is probably a little lower on my list than he should be. We also got Garrett Wilson there at 25. 26, 27, 28, 29, that goes to T. Higgins, Michael Pittman Jr., Deontay Johnson, and DJ Moore. 30 to 36, you ready for this? Here we go. Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Calvin Ridley, Drake London, Marquise Brown, Kendrick Bourne, and Josh Downs. And just missing out this week is Rashee Rice. So you know he's creeping in right around that area, that wide receiver 3 type range moving forward. Now let's continue to move forward. Let's talk about tight ends, and let's talk about, well, number one tight end that I'm starting this week, and that is my man, Dalton Schultz. Again, I love this Texans versus Carolina Panthers matchup. Yes, you're starting Nico Collins. Yes, you're starting CJ Stroud. That means you're also starting Dalton Schultz versus Carolina. Now, Carolina, they're in the middle of the pack when it comes to fantasy points allowed. I think they're about 16th or something like that. But we know that this means more. It just simply means more to CJ Stroud right now. And you look at him and what Schultz have done the last little while. He has targeted his tight end 17 times in the last 2 contests before the bye week. In the last 3 games, Schultz has scored a touchdown in each of those games and produced 14 receptions for 168 yards. There's no reason to believe that this doesn't continue here in week number 8. Another tight end I feel okay about this week is Kyle Pitts. Why? Because he's coming off a disappointing performance there in week number 7 against Tampa Bay. That means you can expect to be down on him where we're not starting him, which means he's going to produce this week, because that is just what happens with Kyle Pitts. It simply is. 8.7 fantasy points per game. Blech. 298 yards. 1 touchdown. Listen, Tennessee, they already traded away their best safety. Kevin Byard, he's not going to be there. That means Kyle Pitts is going to be going out there and having no one opposing him on the back half of that Tennessee Titans defense, which means Kyle Pitts should be able to take advantage of Tennessee, who's already poor when it comes to defending wide receivers, let alone what he's going to be able to do from the tight end position. And say it however you want. He is not your typical tight end. He is a wide receiver who sometimes lines up near the offensive line. Now, another tight end that I like this week, let's go with my man Jake Ferguson, because we know that Dak Prescott, he produces after the bye week. We also know that Dak Prescott loves to look for his tight ends. Ferguson, he promising. Week number 1, almost 10 fantasy points. And then in 3 of the last 4 games there, he struggled. He hasn't done nothing. He basically combined for like 8 fantasy points in those 4 games. I don't know what those numbers actually look like, but last week, that usage, it started to come back up. He played 86% of the snaps against the Chargers, and while the production wasn't there, the opportunity happened to be there. So this week, I feel good about him going against the Los Angeles Rams. So a Rams team right now that, if you look at the last 4 weeks, the Los Angeles Rams are allowing 18.63 fantasy points to the tight end position. They've given up 23 receptions, 335 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So Jake Ferguson, if he's going to have a breakout game, it is going to be this week. Now we look at maybe some tight ends to sit. I know you're not going to sit him. You can't sit him. You can't afford to sit Evan Ingram versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, but you should be under the impression that the Pittsburgh Steelers, when it comes to defending tight ends this season, they are one of the best teams in the entire National Football League. They come into this contest ranked 4th overall, allowing just 7.3 fantasy points per game. They've given up just 188 yards and just 1 touchdown. They've given up the second fewest receptions so far this season, 19. They've given up the 188 yards. That is the 3rd fewest receiving yards. There's only the Browns, the Ravens, and Cardinals that are allowing less points than the Pittsburgh Steelers right now. And that's including a 6-catch, 65-yard performance that Mark Andrews had against his Pittsburgh Steelers team. That's kind of the outlier when we're talking about this team. Can Evan Ingram also be an outlier? Sure, he can be. He is one of the most targeted, if not the most, I think he's got the most receptions on this Jaguars team. So if there is another tight end that could possibly get out there, he can get the job done. You know what? If he started dating Taylor Swift, I'd feel much better about this contest. Let's put it that way. Now, some other tight ends that I'm maybe not starting, I'm not feeling very good about. I mean, you're starting as studs. Tight end's always one of those positions that's really weird when it's all said and done. Now, another tight end I'm not starting this week is Cole Kmet versus the Los Angeles Chargers. And it's not because the Chargers are a tough team. I think they're 18th when it comes to opposing tight ends. It's the fact that I still can't get behind Tyson Bagent here starting. We know he replaced him in week number 7. And guess what? It was an awful performance by Kmet, 0 targets. So what makes you think that suddenly this is going to change here in week number 8? Chicago is going to run the ball. That is what they're going to do, and it's going to come at the expense of Cole Kmet, unfortunately. Another tight end that's on my bust list here is Logan Thomas. Why? Because I think he has an opportunity to do something, but he's going against the Philadelphia Eagles. Yes, Thomas has been good. 23 receptions, 236 yards, 2 touchdowns, 9.5 fantasy points per game. 9.5 fantasy points per game from your tight end is actually pretty good. Thomas, going back to the last game against Philadelphia in week number 4, he actually had 41 yards on 3 catches. Now, I don't know if Kevin Byard is going to be ready to play for the Eagles this week, but if he's in the lineup, that definitely has to put a little bit of a damper on any kind of production that Logan Thomas is going to be capable of doing. So for that reason, I'm going to fade Logan Thomas here in week number 8. And with that said, here is my top, let's say, 15 tight ends here for week number 8. It starts with Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Sam Laporta, George Kittle, TJ Hawkinson. No big shockers there in the top 5. Dallas Goedert, Darren Waller, Evan Ingram. Yes, I know Evan Ingram's on my sit list, but he still comes in at number 8. Kyle Pitts at number 9, Dalton Schultz at number 10. Now, 11 through 15, Dalton Kincaid, Jake Ferguson, Logan Thomas, Taysom Hill, Michael Mayer. Let's keep going. David Njoku at 16. Trey McBride at 17. These are guys that you could possibly get in at the back end. I just don't feel as good about them. What I do feel good about is you tuning in each and every week to listen to me talk about my starts and sits here on the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast. We are coming back at you each and every week. Next week, Major Caldwell and Tara Roberts should be joining me here in the studio, so you'll get their starts and sits as well. So we will see you next week.